Today, we're gonna forge and make our own Norse Viking belt. Stay tuned. Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. So I'm not actually sure what these are called in the end. I've seen them called a bunch of different things. Norse belts, witch belts, Viking belts, rope belts. I'm gonna call it like a Norse rope belt for now. Yell at me in the comments if I'm wrong or if you know what it's actually called. So I wanted to do this project because it's kind of a really simple one. I do a lot of steps that I don't have to get a really cool result, but in the end, when you add it to a costume, it adds so much to it that I wanted one, and I wanted to know how to make one. And it turns out they're like stupidly easy. So when I was looking into how to make this, there's a variety of ways that you can go about it. The simplest way that I saw people make it is using a wooden ring, which honestly you can get from a place like Michael's or even off Amazon. I decided to go for forging my own little ring here because I don't get the chance to forge very often, and I know the basics of how to do it. If you haven't seen it, I made an episode right here. I think that's the right side to point. That is me forging a heart. And if you watch that, I go over basically the same things that I used to make this, except instead of twisting it inward to make it heart, I twist it outward to make a loop, which is a personal choice. A lot of the belts that I've seen like this also twist it inward at the bottom. I just thought this looked cool. So to get started on forging this, first I got a piece of string. This is actually a piece of leather cordage because honestly that's easier to find in Clever's workshop than string. And I cut it the length of when I put it together into a circle, it makes about the size I'm looking for. That way I can lay it flat and see how much metal I'm gonna use. Then I added a few inches for the little curves at the bottom because I know that they come off the circle. All in all, it ended up being around a foot. From there, it's very similar to how I made this heart, in which case I heated up either sides of the metal one at a time and slowly drew out the ends into points. Because I wasn't going for as much as a curve or as much detail as the heart, I didn't really pull the points that far, just enough to get the look of it and to make sure they didn't end suddenly. I go into a lot more detail of how to do this in my heart video. I will admit, we had one propane tank and we didn't want to go buy another one, so I tried to do it quickly because we are cheap, and I am perfectly fine with it looking a little bit rough because if it is kind of like a witchy belt, and looking a little bit rough around the edges, if anything adds to it. So once I had the edges pulled down to a point, then I went and I curved the whole thing. That way I can get the overall curve of the circle. Going back, I probably would have done the curves at the end first, because when I curved it together and made it not a straight line anymore, it actually made it a lot more difficult to work with when it comes to fitting it into the forge. And also being able to like grab it and work the different edges. It made it a lot smaller of a surface space for my hammer to be able to fit around. But past Maddie doesn't know that, so she happily curves it into a circle. Then I start to bend back the edges using pliers to really twist it into the shape that I want. You'd be surprised how easy it is to move the metal with pliers, just kind of pulling it in different directions once you've heated it up enough. As long as you get pliers that put your hand far enough back from it. You can see that once I have gone at it with the pliers, I pretty much have my general shape, and from here it's very much just nitpicking it into exactly what I want. Since I know that I'm going to be using these bottom loops as places to hang more rope, I wanted to curve the ends outward so that they didn't end up catching on the rope as I pressed them into the space. So because it's such a small space and such a fine detail, I went in with some needle nose pliers and curved it back in on itself, which you got to admit, once you start going into those fine details with like the needle nose pliers, like you'll look like a professional blacksmith, or at least you feel like it. I felt like it. From there, it's a lot more of just nitpicking. I realized I had made one loop a little bit bigger than the other loop, and then every time I tried to fix the loops, I would mess up the big circle, making it kind of wonky. So I just went back and forth and kept hammering it in different ways until it did what I wanted. Then I made sure to flatten it all down, because a lot of times when you are moving it around in different ways, you end up warping it one way or another. And if you're working on something that you want to be flat at the end, you can just hammer that side and it will flatten. Honestly, besides the heat of it, blacksmithing is a surprisingly forgiving craft. You can just mess up over and over and over again, and you just kind of hammer it back into place after. After I was happy with the final shape, which apparently looks like an octopus getting ready to box. That meme comes from Clever. You can blame him for it. I made sure it was cool by leaving it in some water to cool. I'm not making a blade or anything from this, so I don't have to worry about the hardness or tempering it correctly. But after it was cool, I went over with a Dremel and cleaned up the outside of it, making sure to clean off any of that flaky dark metal or any sort of soot that got on the metal while I was forging. I also went in with some sandpaper to try to smooth down some of the more rough areas. While I want it to look rough, I don't want it to be so rough that I could potentially slowly wear away my rope while it's wrapped around it. Afterward, it's got some of its shine back from before I started hitting it with a hammer, and maybe I can see the octopus thing. Now that we have the angry octopus that we're gonna wrap all this around, we need to figure out our ropes. So like I said before, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. Not only can you have different materials, but you can also wrap these around in different ways. I've seen people do 2 really big chunky ropes that are heavily braided and gorgeous and wonderful. And I've seen people do 4 smaller ones, that way that they can wrap it around their body in more intricate ways. I wrapped it around so that I had 4 smaller ones, but each of the smaller ones also split into 2. That way, I can wrap it around my body in so many ways. The actual length that you're going for really depends on what you're going to use it for. Mine ended up being pretty long, which lets me wrap it around myself in a lot of intricate ways. But if I want to wrap it around in simple ways, it can be a little bit too long. A belt isn't a good belt if it trips you on the way to the battlefield. So my recommendation is to take a measuring tape and just wrap it around your body in the patterns that you think you want to use so that you can see how much of an end product you want. For me, I was very, very lazy, and I found these leftover bits of rope that Clever had made for his hand fasting cord video here. In it, he went over how to take yarn and make it into a sturdier, thicker rope by basically just taking a drill to it. He explains it much better than I do. I recommend watching the video. But he so happened to leave behind almost exactly what I needed. So I was lucky in the sense that all of the ropes, when laid out, were pretty long, and there was 4 of them, which meant that in order to tie them on like this, you kind of fold them in half and have these 2 tails coming out. Even folded in half, look how long these are. He made so much. But again, you can use almost anything. You can use normal yarn, you can braid it, you can get scraps of cloth. I've seen people use what's almost like a mix of cloth and yarn, where it's a thin strip of cloth just wrapped around itself over and over again like yarn. But like I said, I'm lazy, so I'm using these. Also, they're autumn colored. They're green and white and orange, and I do know of at least one autumn fae that might enjoy having it. So the main problem with these ropes is that the ends of them were different. Because he had taken them, folded them in half, and then twisted them, one half was open and the other half was bent in on itself. So I just went through and cut open the bent in on itself part. And in order to achieve this sort of tassel end, I very painstakingly unraveled the ends of each of the ropes until I had basically the same rough tassel look. And I did this on both ends of each rope. Now that I have my finished ropes, I'm going to show you just how easy it is to end up with a finished belt. And remember, you don't need to forge your own centerpiece. You can do almost everything with just a normal wooden ring. So I did the very highly complex task that is tying each of these ropes onto the ring of my angry octopus. To do this, I folded it in half equally. Then I passed the tails through its own loop, making sure it goes over the metal circle. This ties it around my angry octopus and locks it into place. A lot of the example photos that I saw of other people making this had more braiding and knots going down at least the first couple of inches and then the very end. Because my rope is already kind of braided together and a little bit thick, I was worried that it would end up being too chunky. Plus I liked the simple look of just having it wrapped around once. But with my ropes all attached to the center, I decided to try it out because at that point, it's basically a functional belt. And look at all the cool ways that I can wrap this around. Each of those ropes can be wrapped around yourself in different ways, or you can split them into their 2 different tails and wrap them around as if you had 8 ropes. It's pretty crazy. You don't have to pull all the ropes back to the main belt to lock them into place either. All of these ropes can tie behind your back, be pinned into place. I've seen people do that a lot whenever they loop it around the back of their neck, where they either tie it into place or they have another pin back there that holds them together. It's kind of crazy how many different ways you can use this and how cool it looks when it's done. considering how easy it is to make. I was considering adding a bunch of different decorations and such because it was more autumny colored. I had these metal little leaves that I was gonna add to it. I was gonna try and like weave beads onto the end fibers. But after playing with it and wrapping around myself, I was afraid that it would start to catch on itself if I made it too complex because of, first of all, how much rope it is, but also like how much it's wrapping around you, wrapping around itself. I didn't want to make anything that might rip out or might catch on your clothing or yourself or the belt itself. So I ended up going with these really simple jump rings that I can just open and close by hand to lock in the knots at the end of the rope and at the very beginning where they wrap around the metal ring. This adds a little bit of a shine of metal and also keeps it from potentially starting to unravel if it's left too long and pulled in too many different directions. And there we have it. This is really cool. And it's one of those things that you can add to a costume or like a LARP outfit or anything, and it adds so much depth. Like I've seen people wearing these and I'm like, oh, that's so cool. And I never thought how easy they are to make. While we were playing around with how to do this, before I decided I wanted to forge it myself, Clever actually took one of these metal rings he got from Tandy. He wrapped it all in some leather cordage, making sure to lock it in on itself with a little loop. And now you have this really cool leather ring. I don't know, it's a really cool concept that can be applied in so many simple ways that has such a cool ending result. And that's it. I know it's kind of a simple one. I made it even more complex by just forging it myself. But it's one of those that you try and you have to share because so many people could be making these. If you have any suggestions of how I could have done this differently or what it's actually called, leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this and want to see more I guess, simple and beginner projects, because that's what I can do, hit us with some like it love. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you know when we release new content. In the meantime, keep leveling up, you. You made it to the end screen, YouTube.
You made it to the end screen.
Gah!
It's a fantastic way to support this channel. Oh wait, I don't have a microphone.
Give me that. Give me the microphone.
All right. So yeah, as I was saying, staying to the end is a fantastic way to support this channel. Another fantastic way to support this channel is by joining these people's noble ranks. These are our Patreon members. It's because of the generosity of these incredible people that we're able to do any of this. And a giant shout out to our Grandmaster tier level Patreon members, Andrew Smith, Froggy, Dragon Designs, and Yuri Sakharov. If you like what we do here and want to support us, consider joining our Patreon, link in the description below. Otherwise, you can check out one of these videos that YouTube thinks you'd like, and that helps a lot too. And if you don't mind, I gotta go and readjust my chair. She messes it up whenever she sits on it. Killing me.